I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.
I want to thank you all for joining us today. It is my pleasure to introduce an old friend of the Manhattan Institute, Charles Murray. Charles Murray was right. Those aren't my words, but rather those of President Bill Clinton prior to signing the landmark Welfare Reform Act of 1996. The president was, of course, referring to Charles's first book as a Manhattan Institute Senior Fellow, Losing Ground, which forever changed the national discourse on welfare reform. In fairness to the president, he strongly disagreed with Charles's proposed solutions for poverty, but there was no arguing that as a nation, we started to look at the problem in a different way. Now with his new book, Coming Apart, Charles is once again launching a nationwide public debate. Nick Kristof in the New York Times wrote, "We're facing a crisis in which a chunk of working class Americans risk being calcified into an underclass marked by drugs, despair, family decline, high incarceration rates, and a diminishing role of jobs and education as escalators of upward mobility. We need a national conversation about these dimensions of poverty, and maybe Murray can help trigger it." Now, as Charles's book gains traction, of course, the attack dogs have come out in force. I don't mean those with valid critiques of Charles's work, but rather those who accuse him of acting in bad faith. Murray deliberately misuses statistics. He's the slick front man for a well-funded right-wing propaganda machine. I have to laugh. I have to laugh when I think of the real history of Charles's first book for the Manhattan Institute, Losing Ground. What we paid Charles in those days wouldn't cover the cost of a year's tuition at a New York City preschool. Our high-powered PR strategy, brilliantly orchestrated by my boss at the time, Bill Hammett, was to host a small Liberty Fund conference here in New York, where we invited notorious right-wingers like Ken Auletta, Nathan Glazer, and Michael Kinsley to come and share their thoughts about the book. Some propaganda machine. It seems to me that these rabid critics of Charles's work over the years have really missed the point. They remind me of the scene in The Wizard of Oz where Dorothy's dog Toto inadvertently pulls the curtain back to reveal the would-be wizard frantically pulling on bells and whistles, urging Dorothy and her friends not to pay attention. What Charles Murray does with great courage and clarity is to pull that curtain back for all of us and force us to see the world in a new way. Once we do, there really is no way to pull the curtain back. That's why he is, right or wrong, the most consequential social scientist of his generation. Please join me in welcoming Charles Murray.
Wow, thank you. Thank you very much. It's just wonderful to be back at Manhattan Institute. Larry, for what? How many lunches have I had for books? Basically all of them, with the lunch for the bell curve maybe being the most memorable. I was standing over there in the podium then, and the questioning started, and Jonathan Alter was over there, and as he asked the question, the venom in his voice and in his look told me I definitely was not in Kansas anymore, and that it was going to be a real long struggle. I hope there is no comparable experience today out there. This is not the usual crowd because a lot of you have either read the book or read a lot of the reviews of the book, know a good deal about it. You may have watched some of the interviews I've done. And so I don't want to give the same detail I would ordinarily give. So here's my proposition. I'm going to give a bare bones précis of the argument with not much data. And then I want to deal with two of the reactions to the book that I think I ought to respond to. One of them has to do with the way the labor market has changed and the argument that what Murray is really looking at, if in terms of causes, is the declining availability of good jobs for low-income people, so forth and so on. And the other is that I am constantly being asked for solutions. And I have tried saying I don't do solutions, that has not been adequate. So I want to take that on head on with a few remarks. Okay, let's start with the précis of the book. First, why the subtitle, The State of White America, 1960 to 2010? It's very simple. It concentrates the attention of my audience on these issues. Because if I'm going to talk about things like out-of-wedlock births and declining participation in the labor force with national statistics, the very natural reaction, and one I would have, is to say to myself, well, to what extent is he talking about a general problem? To what extent is this focused in the black community or the Latino community or whatever? By referring specifically to white Americans, I take away all of those possible explanations. The second thing I do is limit my data, for most of the indicators, to people ages 30 to 49. So you don't have to worry about people are in school longer, they get married later, they retire earlier. I'm talking about the prime of life, which also clarifies the situation. First thesis is that for the lower end of society, what we have had is a divergence of classes on core institutions and behaviors that have been essential for America to run as America is supposed to run, namely a nation of self-governing people. And I call four of these the founding virtues. In the first drafts of the book, I call them the Republican virtues because they were, in fact, Republican in the old-fashioned sense of the word, and I said, that'll never fly. So I changed them to founding virtues for the published version. But the founders were united in saying this Constitution will not work for just any kind of people. It's not enough to get the laws right. You have to have, quote, virtue in the people, in Madison's words. And they had a consensus on some of the qualities that were absolutely essential, a consensus which was joined by early observers of America, such as Alexis de Tocqueville. And the four that there was consensus on were industriousness, which is perhaps the defining characteristic of Americans at that time, what they called marital morality, but I will refer to as the institution of marriage, plain American honesty and respect for the law, and the fourth was religiosity. Thomas Jefferson included thought that religion was absolutely essential as a function of a self-governing people, because self-government means a kind of restraint on one's own behavior that religion fostered. On all four of those, there has been what was formerly a common set of behaviors across American classes that over the last 50 years has diverged. I'm not saying that the working class was exactly the same as the upper middle class. Those are the two classes I'm comparing. I'm saying they were real close. And marriage is the central example. 1960, you had about 94% of white in the upper middle class who were married, compared to about 84% of whites in the working class. 2010, that was 84% in the upper middle class. Marriage has been quite stable now for about 20 years. Divorce has been down. It's still the norm. In the white working class, as of 2010, ages 30 to 49, 48% are married, less than half. That's partly divorce, but a lot of it is never married, so that you have a third of all white males ages 30 to 49 in the working class who have never been married. And all of those of us who think George Gilder was right about the way that marriage civilizes men have to worry about that, because when men do not get married, they behave worse in all sorts of ways, ranging from crime to labor force behavior. So I go through the ways in which these divergences have occurred. I won't go through all of that. Let me tell you, it exists. Then we have a problem at the other end of society. At this point, I'm not talking about the upper middle class in general. I am talking about the elites. And the elites I divide into two broad groups. One is the broad elite, which is the people who are the most successful in the professions, in managerial positions, people who are most successful in the media and so forth. The people who run the country. The broad elite are people who are most important in their own area. The most important people in San Francisco or Dallas or Indianapolis or Des Moines. The narrow elite consists of those who have an effect on a national level. So that you are talking now about the most influential journalists, the most influential executives in the TV and film industry, constitutional lawyers, the key financial and corporate structures in America, and of course the politicians who are in those positions. Now, if you're talking about the narrow elite, you are talking about people who live in or around 4 areas, basically. Washington, D.C., New York City, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, or that corridor that goes from San Francisco down to San Jose. Within this group, within the elites, there has developed over the last 30 years a distinctive culture. David Brooks' Bobos in Paradise was the book that laid it out in delicious detail, but it is all the ways in which there is a new upper-class culture that differs from mainstream America in the age at which we marry, because I'm going to say we, because I'm talking to a room full of the people that are part of the problem. I put myself in that category. We marry at later ages. We have distinctive ways of raising our children. We would never, ever drink mass-market American beer. We watch very little television. Okay, a masterpiece theater maybe occasionally, but some of us even brag we don't have a television anymore. Well, in the rest of America, you have people who watch 35 hours a week. You have movies that the new upper class never sees. You have pastimes and avocations and so forth that never touch the new upper class. I've got it, chapter 4 in the book, I think it's 4, has a quiz called How Thick Is Your Bubble? Has 25 questions, a maximum of 100 points, and it has a variety of questions on it. I think my favorite of the 25 is, have you ever held a job that caused a body part to hurt at the end of the day? Because I think the answer to that question says a lot. If you have not ever held a job that causes a body part to hurt at the end of the day, you are completely unable to empathize with the vast majority of Americans who have. And a very substantial proportion of Americans who have jobs where they hurt every day, all day. There are other questions. You ever bought a pickup truck? Have you gone fishing in the last 5 years? But then you get to questions such as, have you ever, for a year in your life, lived in a neighborhood where among the 50 closest of your neighborhoods, a majority did not have college degrees? What I'm trying to get at is that whether we know it or not, we do live in a bubble. We don't have contact with the vast majority. Quick additional illustration. If your kids go to a private school or to a public school in an affluent suburb, the admissions policies for the private schools almost definitely mean that there is no child in that school with an IQ below the national mean of 100. That means that your children, as they leave school, think they know what people who aren't very smart are like, because they think of the dummies in their class. The dummies in their class are above the national average. Now, I don't want that to be inferred as saying, gee, there's this unwashed mass of the other half they've never seen. That's exactly the opposite of my point. There are lots of really interesting, fun, admirable, entertaining people in the bottom half of that distribution. Lots and lots and lots. And they have no idea. They have no understanding. Our children have no understanding of that half of the population. Okay, that's and then one other piece to this is the development of the super zips. One of the most interesting tables, I think, in the book is when I assembled data using census tracts for the 1960 census on 14 of the most elite neighborhoods in the country. So that included the Upper East Side of New York, the Westchester County, southern Westchester County, North Shore of Chicago, you know the standard Beverly Hills and so forth. Taking all 14 of those as a whole, in current purchasing power, the median income in 1960 was $84,000. That is not affluence. Only 26% of the people in those 14 elite neighborhoods had college degrees. which says not only did you have a lot of two-parent families but neither one had a college degree, it means that the great majority of people in that neighborhood probably were first-generation successful. They themselves had grown up in working-class neighborhoods or middle-class neighborhoods, and they were real successful now, but they brought to their adulthood a memory of what the rest of America was like. Now, in the 2000 census, and by the way, these numbers are going to be a lot worse in the 2010 census. In the 2000 census, median income in those 14 neighborhoods was up to $163,000, which does mean you have an awful lot of affluent people in those neighborhoods. Percentage of college degrees, if I remember correctly, was up to 67%. And not only that, you have a very large proportion of those, a disproportion of those who are coming from elite schools with all the socialization that goes on with that group, who I have labeled in the book overeducated elitist snobs, which that's a technical term, and since I went to Harvard, I feel that I'm entitled to dump on my own kind. So that exacerbates the separation of the cultures, and the children in the second generation and third generation even more isolated. Say the second generation does not have memories of their childhood that they bring to their adulthood, which still keeps them in touch with the rest of America. That is the argument about the nature of the class problem that we have. And I suggest to you it is different in kind from anything we have known before, in kind. And also, and I'm not being apocalyptic here, if it goes on, it spells the end of America as the American ideal. And by that I mean, it used to be everybody sort of pretended they were in the middle class. And to build a 50,000 square foot house would have been considered unseemly and ostentatious. So you had executives in major corporations making lots of money who still drove Buicks. And the reason they drove Buicks instead of Cadillacs was Cadillacs were just too showy. They were too ostentatious. There was a sense of seemliness out there and of appropriate behavior that was very different among the wealthy and the powerful then than it is now. Today, we've lost, let me put it this way. Insofar as we become an America in which the upper class is pleased with being part of the upper class and self-consciously considers that to be different from the rest of America, to the extent to which they feel much more kinship with Europeans of their same socioeconomic level than they do with people in flyover country, we aren't the country that a great many of us loved in the past. Now, to the two issues that I said I would address. One involves the labor market. And essentially the argument goes like this. Over the last 40 years, since the high point in 1973, we have had the disappearance of good unionized jobs and manufacturing jobs and so forth. And it used to be that men could earn a family wage, which enabled them to support a wife and children. Now they can't do that. And also that the dignity attached to work at low-level jobs has disappeared, and there's a great deal of demoralization that's gone on. Now, there are a variety of problems with that interpretation, and I say problems rather than ways to refute it utterly, because these things have had an effect. But I don't think it's enough to glibly say that this explains the kind of divergence in behavior that we have seen. Let me make a couple of points. First, the myth of the family wage. If you take the census data from 1960, and if you take the current population survey from 2010, both downloadable when you go home this afternoon, and if you define occupations as working class occupations that you think is reasonable, and you look up the mean earnings among whites ages 30 to 49, for those working class occupations in 1960 and in 2010, guess what? They will be within a few dollars of each other in constant purchasing power. Actually, if you go back to 2008, before the recession set in, it'll be about $3,000 more in mean earnings for somebody working at those jobs. So the idea that there was a golden age back there and the working class has gotten poorer than it used to be on average, I simply think does not stand up to examination. You can still support a wife and children if you are working class in 2010, but very many fewer do it than did before. Is it because of demoralization and these jobs are beneath their dignity and so forth? Well, I don't know if I should use my own family as an example, but I will tell you that there is an emporium called Italy down the street, maybe 20, 30 blocks. It's a very large emporium selling Italian foods and things. If you go there after you leave the Harvard Club and go to the espresso bar, it may very well be my daughter who serves you the espresso for $10 an hour, which she's making. And she's, by the way, now 26 years old, graduate from a really good college. And her fiancé, who is a trained architect, is 27 years old, has also been working there. He recently got a part-time job as an actual architect, so we were hoping for the best there. But they're both working at those jobs. Now, I think it is probably true if you ask my daughter why she's doing it, she would acknowledge that she was raised in a house where you were taught that it was good to work and so forth. But if you ask her why she's working at the job, her more immediate answer is going to be because there's rent to pay every month, because there's food you've got to buy to put on the table. They are working to support themselves, and neither one of them feels demeaned. And $10 an hour is actually a lot less than the average wage for most working class jobs. So that, let's take the classic working class job, janitor, all right? The median hourly wage for janitors, now I'm going to be off by maybe as much as $1. It's in the book. It's something on the order of $12 to $13 an hour. That's for janitor. And there are lots of other working class jobs that pay a lot better than that. So you've got to say, well, why is it that a man feels demeaned by taking that job? It's not enough to say that he does. You've got to say something cultural has happened in the quality called industriousness. And to say that that's not enough money to energize him, to make it respectable, then leads one to ask, well, why is it then that the disability roles have expanded so massively over the last 30, 40, 50 years since 1960? If you think of all the reasons why disability should have gone down over that period, think of all the working class jobs that used to be physically exhausting, such as digging ditches, and now what you do is sit at the controls of a Bobcat and operate it. Think of all the ways in which medicine has enabled us to cure a variety of disabilities, and in other cases to make it possible to work even though you still have the disability. By any rational expectation, we should have a fraction of the physically disabled now that we used to have. Not only has it risen, we also have an industry in this country which consists of people who consult with you on how to get past the government's qualification test for disability benefits. I mean, people make their living doing this. And let me assure you, they are not making their living telling paraplegics how they can qualify for disability. They are making their living telling people who have a very dodgy excuse how they can make it good. You can go to employers, and I don't mean big corporate employers, you can go to any general contractor, small general contractor, and talk to them about the ways in which they cannot get people to come to work for skilled jobs, jobs where they want apprentices, where they want to teach people their craft, where they'll be paying pretty good money to begin with the prospect of $20 and $30 and $40 an hour earnings as they become master craftsmen. And they can't find people to take those kind of jobs. The glib explanations that there just aren't any jobs out there don't work. Now, if at that point you say, Murray, you're still wrong, you give us 5, 6 years of low unemployment and lots of jobs out there, and you will see these problems you're worrying about go away, or at least diminish. We've done that experiment. The rises in dropout from the labor force among males, white males, were just as high in the boom years in the last half of the 90s, the last half of the 80s, part of the 2000s, as they have been in the less prosperous years. I swear that there is no statistical relationship between the nature of the economy and the number of jobs available and the increase in the problems I'm talking about. The second issue goes to causes and solutions. I deliberately don't talk very much about causes because, in a sense, to do so is going to lose me a readership I want to obtain. I wrote this book so that someone on the left can read it without throwing it against the wall. I tried very hard, so that means partly that I do not dwell on, and I barely even mention, the entire argument of losing ground. I still believe that argument, but I don't make the argument because, in a sense, we are where we are. And a lot of the things that have happened over the last 30, 40 years may have been jump-started by the Great Society and the rest of it. That doesn't mean that we can reverse a few simple policies and everything will go back to be the way it was. So I don't dwell on causes, but the solutions issue is a different one. I made my living for more than a decade as a professional evaluator of social programs, which is what led to my views that I expressed in Losing Ground. And so when I go through the laundry list of potential programs that are presented to me by Ross Douthat, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, or by David Brooks or others, I say to myself, I know how these programs work. We have tried these kinds of programs. The answers are in, and they aren't going to accomplish anything. And I refuse to present a set of solutions that I myself don't believe in. But that gets to a deeper question, which is we aren't ready to talk about solutions because the kinds of changes that are required, first, a lot of times are changes in individual behavior, not changes in government policy. And insofar as there are changes in government policy out there, they're going to have to be big ones, really big strategic ones. And that requires a national consensus we don't have. I guess I would use the example of the civil rights movement, perhaps as an imperfect analogy, but an analogy. All the trend lines on the problems that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was intended to solve, all of those trend lines were moving in the direction that they should be moving in well before the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. And in fact, after it was passed, those trend lines did not get better at a steeper angle. On the contrary, this is the story of Losing Ground, a lot of them stopped getting better. But my point is this, things were getting better, and the reason they were getting better was because there had been a change in the culture. And that change in the culture was triggered indeed by the civil rights movement, which not only got blacks energized, it also changed the consciousness of white America. Now, as I say, an imperfectly analogous way, we need a change in the culture here. We need change, for example, insofar as the upper middle class, which is pretty much doing the right thing with regard to marriage and industriousness and religiosity and honesty, needs to start preaching what they practice. We have got to end the non-judgmentalism, which says, in effect, gee, marriage and vocation have really been wonderful for me, and they are the sources of satisfaction in my life that lead me to say I'm happy. But of course, I wouldn't want to say that everybody should do that. It would be really healthy if people who think deeply about why they are living satisfying lives decide that the reasons have to do with core cultural values that they are not trying to promulgate as being good things to do. I think I've lost my train of thought in this sentence. The point is, they got to start talking about this stuff out loud. And that will also involve a certain amount of stigmatization of the other kind of behavior. But if you're going to have a society that works because of social norms, then there has to be a flip side to giving people praise and rewards for some kinds of behavior. And that flip side is to say of other kinds of behaviors, these are bad. Another thing has to change, and now I'm talking about the new upper class. The new upper class has to first take a close look at the unseemliness that I referred to earlier. And there is a lot of it going on. There is a lot of a kind of flaunting of wealth. There is a lot of things that are within the law, but smack of an in-group that has arranged a cozy little club whereby they have access to advantages the rest of society doesn't. The term crony capitalism has real meaning. And I think people who are libertarians like me, but I think conservatives more generally, should be as critical, and I was trying to come up with a stronger word, emotionally critically, viscerally critical of crony capitalism as anybody on the left. It is utterly in opposition to what we should be holding as our ideal. Similarly, on all of there's another thing that I want the new upper class to think about. Do you really want to live in a neighborhood where everybody else is just like you? You know, I'm not saying you should go live in the slums. I'm not even saying you should go live in a middle-class neighborhood. But aren't there more interesting neighborhoods where you have a really nice house, and you can send your kids to good schools, but where there's a little more variety, a little more interest in terms of how people make their livings and the kinds of livings they make, and above all, interest in the sense that you are in a community which has problems that needs to be solved. I mean, just where there is some stuff of life in the place you are living. Now, in New York City, I understand that's not like making that same recommendation in Washington, D.C. I understand that if you're living in the city in New York, there are constraints. But for those of us who move outside the city, there are lots of ways we can live our lives which give our children a whole lot better chance to understand what America is like than the chance we're giving them now. All of those things are not going to happen because of a government program. These changes in the culture are going to happen because a conversation has ensued, as it did during the Civil Rights Movement, and which, over a period of time, we had a change in the culture. Cultures can change. The United States has done it in the past. You have to start somewhere. This book is my attempt for my starting point. Thank you very much.
Stay right where you are. That's fine. It's a big room, obviously, so just a couple of rules. I will wait for me to acknowledge you, and wait for the microphone to get to you. We want everybody to hear your question, just make it brief. So I'll tell you what. I'll start way in the back with Mr. Tim Ferguson. Why don't we do that?
Hi, Charles. Congratulations. You began your talk with a nod to American exceptionalism. Do I take this to mean that the experiences around the world, as close as Canada or as far as Asia, are not evidence to bear on this discussion?
But they aren't exceptional in the same way America has been. If you're saying, are the phenomena that I'm talking about, are they ones that have been experienced throughout a wide variety of nations in the Western world, the answer is yes. What it makes the American case different is that France doesn't really bother them that they will have a class system or do have a class system of the same kind we're having, or that these classes are diverging, because in France, it was never the case that everybody prided themselves on being middle class. In France, it was never the case that there was a brotherhood, supposed to be a brotherhood within the nation. It is the United States civic culture that is being destroyed by the trends I'm talking about, and these other nations didn't have a civic culture like that to be destroyed. Just to elaborate a little bit, American community, social capital generated in our communities, has been a central part of our exceptionalism. There are countries around the world that have very generous traditions of hospitality to strangers and so forth, but the idea that people who happen to live in propinquity, even though they weren't related, that they would engage in all kinds of cooperative efforts to educate their kids and to build their community and to do this, that, and the other thing, forming associations at the drop of a hat, as Tocqueville said. This has been unique, and it's been wonderful, and it's going away. It never existed in a lot of these cultures, so it can't go away. So the trends in marriage, crime, etc., yeah, they're the same. They mean something different for America.
Thank you to Roy Murdoch with the Atlas Economic Research Foundation. Thank you very much for your terrific remarks.
I'm wondering if you could compare 1960 and 2010 in terms of perceptions and attitudes that the working classes would have had towards the upper classes. As somebody from Queens looking across the East River at the Upper East Side, or San Pedro looking up the coast at Malibu, would there be kinship, resentment, and how those attitudes have changed across 50 years?
Every time I'm asked a question that I don't know the answer to, I have to tell myself, say you don't know the answer. You're right. Look, in the big cities, I just don't know. But there were a great many corporations who were located in small cities and towns throughout the country. So what I'm about to say is not nostalgia about a unique case. I'm talking about something that was actually quite common. I lived in Newton, Iowa, grew up in Newton, Iowa, where the Maytag Company used to be. And I lived within a block and a half of Fred Maytag II. My dad was a mid-level executive. Also within a block and a half radius of where, maybe a 3-block radius of where Fred Maytag lived, were other very successful people in Newton, but there were also low-level workers. There were insurance agents. The sheriff lived in that same radius along with his wife, who gave piano lessons, and there was also a guy called Over the River Charlie who lived in a rundown house and had chickens in his backyard, which, when he chopped their heads off, provided us children with an exciting day. Okay, so that was the mix of people in a town which is a fairly typical company town. And people did interact with each other. And it was this, what I said, people drove Buicks. My dad drove an Oldsmobile because he thought Buicks were a little bit too showy, you know. So it's not nostalgia to say there was lots more mixing. And I will add something else. We just forget about the role of lodges and fraternal societies and the Masons and so forth. This used to be a big thing in the United States. And Theda, can't pronounce her last name, Skopjol, something like that, at Harvard, wrote a wonderful book called Diminished Democracy, where she describes the role those used to play in leading to the mixing of the classes. And so you would have, you know, presidents of the United States, and also senior corporation CEOs and so forth, who on their resumes were very proud of their membership in these lodges and so forth, which drew their membership from across the socioeconomic spectrum. Was there in New York City, you know, a New York 400 or whatever that considered themselves to be an elite? Yeah, sure there was. That's just a fraction of the people around. They actually weren't people around the country. They were getting kind of peripheral. They were old money. Among the people around the country, there was an awful lot, both in their own experience, because they were self-made men, they were usually men, or in terms of their daily experience as adults. They still were around wide varieties of people.
Just want to make sure that I get over in that corner.
My name is Sidney Williams, and again, I want to thank you very much for showing up here. My question basically is, do you think there is a possibility of a solution that's emerging through the administrations of governors like Mitch Daniels, Scott Walker, Bobby Jindal in Louisiana, beginning to emerge?
Are you talking about specific policies or about the way they govern?
The policies that they've been arguing and the way in which they govern.
On this one, I don't know what the state policies are. I will say I think Mitch Daniels' failure to run for the presidency is a national tragedy, because I think he is as close as we have to a person who was going to take us back there. But I can't comment more specifically than that.
Okay, Michael, you had a question?
Yes, I'm Michael Myers, New York Civil Rights Coalition. I understand why you would avoid the issue of race in talking about the state of white America. But don't you not think that in the 21st century, the notion of race is different now, that being white is not what it used to be? I mean, you have white people who are intermarrying, who have transracial adoptions, whose families are not all white. There's a question about racial identity that I think you need to address, even as you try to avoid the racial factions and controversies of the past.
Chapter 17. In the penultimate chapter, which is entitled One Nation Divisible, I say, okay, I've been giving you numbers for white America. I'm now going to give you numbers when we add in everybody, the whole population. And I present a representative sample of graphs that I'd shown earlier in the book only for whites. Guess what? The trend lines look virtually the same. There are a couple of exceptions, but essentially it's amazing. And I was surprised, the degree to which the trend lines don't budge. Now, part of that is explainable by the fact that even though we're a much more multicultural society than we used to be, you've still got a large majority who are non-Latino white. So they will drive the trend lines to some extent. But let's take something like the family, where the problems in the black family have been getting publicity now for the last 30, 40 years. And you say, well, gee, that's going to make that trend line, if you look at all of America, it's going to be a lot worse than it is for just white America. Not true. Because you not only add in the black population when you add in all of America, you also add in a Latino population that has higher marriage rates than the white working class, and you add in an Asian population that has much higher marriage rates than the white working class, and things sort of average out. So the book has data primarily about white America to clarify the issue. The problems I am talking about are American problems.
But you missed my point. My point was,
Just briefly, because I don't want to have to be.
my question was related not to the black family or the white family, but the possibility that people do not any longer identify by race, that families, or the nation of family is not racial anymore.
Well, I guess that I don't understand how that is relevant to the statistics I gave, since people on the census and in the current population survey are given a whole bunch of combinations that they can identify themselves as. They can identify themselves as multiracial and this, that, and the other thing. So all I took was those who said white only, not Latino. So I don't see the issue.
Okay. I'll tell you what, over here in the center.
Christy Kendall. Two questions. One, do you have any data to support that this isn't just nostalgia, this idea that elites now are more showy in their wealth?
Yeah.
I can think of a lot of historical examples. Hearst Castle, the Vanderbilts. I mean, I know it was the front page of the Wall Street Journal last week or whatever, these 50,000 square foot
Yeah.
homes, but it seems to me that there isn't, well, do you have any data
No,
to support
no,
that?
you just made my point for me. That essentially you can identify those famous places like Biltmore, the Vanderbilts built, and Pocantico Hills or whatever it is the Rockefellers had, except for Beverly Hills and maybe the very wealthiest suburbs of New York in 1960, you did not have neighborhoods that consisted entirely of really, really big houses, mansions. It was a very, very constricted number of neighborhoods around the country that had those. Ones which now you can go to Potomac, Maryland, or you can go, we can name 500 of the suburbs that now consist of mansion after mansion after mansion after mansion. So did you have any mansions in 1960? Yeah, you did. If you want to get a sense of how things have changed, go download an episode of Mad Men that has Don Draper's home shown in it. Don Draper, for those of you who don't watch Mad Men, since I know a lot of you don't watch TV, but Mad Men is one of the series you may watch because that's more popular among the new upper class. He was a big, big deal in a big New York advertising firm. So he's definitely elite. Look at the kitchen of his home. This little tiny kitchen. Look at the living room, little tiny living room. He is living in a house that a man in his position would probably have lived in. It's a very accurate recreation of what an upper middle class person, or even a little bit above that, lived in 1960. And it is the kind of home which would have the living space which a great many in the new upper class would find virtually slum size in terms of what they require now. So there has been a huge change there. One other statistic on this, since you asked me if I have statistics, you were really opening up a hornet's nest there. In Chevy Chase, In Chevy Chase, Maryland, which then as now was one of the most elite neighborhoods in the country, the average price of homes being advertised for sale in the weekend before John Kennedy was killed was twice the average cost of new homes being built all over America that year. Twice. Not true anymore.
Ken, did you ever, yeah, Ken.
Ken Gilman. It would seem that other than a few media outlets, the academic elites, the media elites, for the better part of 30 years have denigrated hard work at the lower level of the income scheme. They promoted a sense of the false self-esteem movement, and the notion of shame has left society. How do you attack the cultural issue you're identifying and have identified accurately if you're not going to be able to publicize and reclaim some of that ground?
Well, that's what we have to do. I mean, when I was talking about preaching what we practice, and you know, this is a diffuse thing. How is it that 50 years ago it was taken for granted that to have a baby out of wedlock was a terrible, terrible thing? It's not that parents went around constantly, lecturing to their children on that, but it was in the air, as it were, and there was no countervailing set of pressures. Well, similarly, it needs to be in the air now that, in the case of work, that to be a healthy person and not being willing to work to support yourself makes you a bum. My role that I can do is to say that in a book. The role that you can do is, upon hearing that and deciding that if you agree with it, being much more candid when in conversation. So whether you're at a dinner party and this comes up, be willing to say what I just said, you know? Now, this means you've got to be at dinner parties with people who disagree with you, but I'm quite literally serious. I'm quite literal when I say the function of this book is to start, I shouldn't say a conversation, I want to start 1 million conversations about these things, and I want to change the culture. I don't mean that in a grandiose sense of I think I can do that personally, but I want a change in the culture to occur, and this is, you start the journey of 1,000 miles with a single step. So.
Randy Filer had a question.
Yeah, I'm probably loud enough without a microphone.
You are.
Back to chapter 17 for a minute, Charlie, because you referred to the ethnic, if you will, groups, and I'm struck. You say, okay, it's time for those on the left to start administering shame, but maybe it's time for those on the right to realize something too. It is an American problem you're talking about, but if you go back to those 4 founding virtues, it's not a new American problem. And is there actually a solution argument to say we really need to encourage more of those new Americans who still have the founding virtues?
Oh, in terms of immigration?
Yes.
Okay, 2 comments on that inflammatory topic. One, I believe...
Something inflammatory.
Yeah. Just 2 comments. And one is, I think that as a libertarian, I think a nation should be able to control its own borders. And I think that's one of the functions, the legitimate functions of a nation state. So I think the illegal immigration that has gone on, the massive, I think that's been a really bad idea, and we got to change that and all that. So having said that, I will say that in my life in rural Maryland, where I live, we now have a fairly large Hispanic population that has moved in. And I've had a fair amount of contact in various ways with a lot of these people who are here. I don't know whether they're legal or illegal. And I got to say, in terms of the way that they act and they work and they are cooperative and so forth, they sure look like real Americans to me. And I think that's the lifeblood of the vitality of our culture. So, yeah, I agree with you on that.
Can I try one in the back, and then I'll come up to the front, okay? Let's see. Michael, back there? The very back.
The town I was born in and grew up in the 70s and 80s, I think, was a normal place, like you're talking about, and is now definitely part of the bubble in Northern California. And the thing that interested me is when you compared incomes for working class jobs then and now, and you said, look, it's essentially the same or even more money now the working class can live. They definitely can't in that corridor you described from San Francisco down to San Jose, because housing prices and other prices of things are just so phenomenally expensive that even if I wanted to move home and live in my parents' neighborhood with my current income, I couldn't do it. I could not afford to buy there. I have my own explanation for how that happened, but I'd like to hear yours.
Yeah, and in places like Aspen, Colorado, all the people who serve the rich folks can't afford to be in Aspen, so they got to be bussed in from distant towns, and this is happening more and more. Doesn't sound much like our traditional notion of America. The thing is that it's driven by very natural causes. This may be a little bit more elaborate answer than you asked for, but you know, it's very normal for people to want to be around other people that they can talk to, that understand their jokes and with whom they share interests and so forth. And in that sense, the tendency of the successful to flock together is entirely normal, and it's just human beings living out their lives as they see fit. But the problem is it produces exactly the phenomenon you're talking about, which is intractable to any outside imposed change, unless it is change that is generated from within. Now, to the extent that that changes the options of people in the working class to make a living, though, you've got a different set of considerations. One is that no, they won't be able to move into that town. But if we're talking about their ability to make a living in a way that is satisfying, I don't think that's particularly relevant. One of the things that's not emphasized when we talk about the disappearance of manufacturing jobs is the multiplication of all kinds of artisanal, if I'm pronouncing that right, jobs, crafts jobs, made-to-order things. Quick example. A guy who worked for a gardening store and was probably making $10, $12, $13 an hour while he was working for the gardening store decided they weren't going to do any landscaping from the store. They were just going to sell stuff, and so he lost his job. And he immediately discovered that the people he'd formerly been working for as part of the gardening store were prepared to buy his services for $30 an hour. That kind of work is not demeaning. To do that kind of work actually is real satisfying. You're engaged in solving problems, creating things of beauty, doing interesting stuff, and the same goes with a whole bunch of other jobs that are available in much larger proportions than they were before. So if I've wandered very far from your question at this point, but it's a point I wanted to make. There are opportunities as well as problems with the new economy. And a lot of what we have failed to do is to point out to people, you know, working on an assembly line wasn't that much fun. And that a lot of these other things that are out there are a lot more fun and they're a lot more remunerative than you may have known. Sorry, don't even know if I answered your question at all, but I'm glad I said all that.
Yeah, we have a question here.
You can hear me, but I'm not sure the others.
Yeah, we want to get the microphone.
So what I was interested in is 50 years is a long time, but what I'm struck by from 1960 to 2010 is that was also a period of great urbanization in this country. And similarly, the values that you are espousing, the founding values, could arguably also be called small town values. Now, I grew up in a small town in the Midwest just like you did. So my question is, in your statistics or in your data, were you able to compare and contrast between urban environments amongst this group and smaller town environments? Because I wonder if a lot of this just isn't due to the fact that because of technology, fewer people are needed on the farm, technology, fewer people are needed in the manufacturing process, and there's been a trend towards urbanization, and have your values declined as a result of that alone? And could you verify that by the basis of statistics?
Well, one way to tackle that issue is to actually examine urban working class communities. Because there are lots of famous urban working class communities, including white working class in South Boston, and the one that I used for my symbol of the white working class, Fishtown. Fishtown is a neighborhood in downtown Philadelphia, right smack dab in the middle of the city, that has been a working class neighborhood since probably the Revolution. And it also had I didn't know this when I started the research, but it had a wonderful PhD dissertation that was participant anthropological, where the woman went to live in Fishtown and recorded extensive interviews and so forth with all the people. And I would argue, first I would say, I bet urbanization has a relationship to some of these phenomena. I'm not dismissing the relationship. That's point number one. Point number two is these trends happened within urban communities that were not getting influxes of outsiders or anything, but had the same people, and the founding virtues changed dramatically over those 50 years, going downhill through the tubes in that kind of constricted environment. So I can't tell you to what degree urbanization explains it, but I can tell you that the phenomenon is also independent of urbanization, and that white working class communities have been going to hell, not only in big cities, but also in small towns. You go out to Iowa, the meth epidemic out there, the out-of-wedlock births, the people on welfare, you have towns that no longer function, white working class towns, in small town America.
Claire, I'm going to let you have the last question.
Charles, I just wanted to comment on great job with the book. I'm Clara Delvalar, and I'm a director with Job Creators Alliance, and I'm reaching out to the Hispanic community to build a network and change the conversation according to some of the comments you made. My question is this: we are using social media and a website to begin this effort. What is your view on how the media has exaggerated these issues that you describe? And the media has to be used to change the conversation. No one would know this better than Mr. Stossel. I'm curious what your thoughts are on these issues.
You say not specifically social media, but media in general.
Well, we're using the website and social media, but my question to you is, how do you think the media has aggravated the issues that you describe in terms of the class differentiation? For instance, making Christian conservatives seem like dullards and buffoons, and basically more open-minded dialogue leading to the change in the social norms. My question is, how do you view the media impacting the past and the future?
The first things that come to mind are sins of omission rather than commission. One of the best kept secrets in terms of what the media is willing to say, politicians too, is that we know statistically, in terms of statistical trends, that out-of-wedlock births are a real serious problem on many dimensions, but not least in terms of the children's own outcomes in life. Everything from their emotional development to their likelihood of being unemployed, to their likelihood of going to prison, you name it. And that this is also true after controlling for socioeconomic status and after controlling for race. This is a consensus which, within academia, believe it or not, is now shared on the left as well as the right. There are many excellent scholars of the left who have publicly said they had to change their mind because the data are too compelling. So here you have what is a really major social problem. You now have in Fishtown, as it were, in white working class America, you now have almost half of all births out of wedlock. Huge social problem. Nobody in the media will say, all family structures are not created equal in terms of the welfare of kids. This doesn't mean you don't have wonderful single mothers trying very hard to raise their kids and often doing a wonderful job. We don't have to demonize anybody. All we have to do is be realistic about outcomes for children and realize the importance that they have fathers. Nobody in the media will do that because that's part of the non-judgmentalism. They're essentially, you're right, it's not possible to say anything denigrating about another group with the exception of poor working class whites. It's okay to call them white trash or rednecks, and it's okay to use derogatory terms for evangelical Christians. But aside from that, you really can't say anything bad about anybody. So that's a major sin of omission. The sins of commission are many. But since this is my last question and my last answer, I think we also have tended to use scapegoats. So I don't think the media has been an engine of this problem in any large sense. They are as much reflecting the culture within which they exist as they are creating it. Well, I love coming to the Manhattan Institute for these lunches, and this has been no exception. Thank you very much.
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.